to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the OnScript podcast, where we explore Bible and theology and the spaces in between them. I'm Matt Lynch, a co-host of the podcast with 5 others. I'm based at Westminster Theological Center in the UK, and I am joined by Matt Bates in Illinois, Drew Johnson in New York City, Aaron Heim in Oxford, Chris Tilling in London, Amy Brown Hughes in Boston. So that's the 6 of us now who co-host the podcast. And just as a reminder, we're a biblical studies-focused podcast, and we also are a theology-focused podcast now that Amy Brown Hughes has joined us. So we have a theology stream that right now puts out 1 episode a month and might increase in the future. So share the word if you want, if you like it and want to hear more of the theology stream. We'd like to grow that side of the podcast as well. Enjoy this episode, and if I could ask you to give us a review on iTunes, we'd all be grateful. Also, if you like what you hear, please share it on Twitter or Facebook or wherever else you like to share things. Or let your postal worker know. They've got all that time walking around all day and need some good theology and Bible to get them through. And also just an update on mugs. We had talked about OnScript mugs like back before Christmas, and the update is we're working on it. You'd think 6 theologians would be able to organize such a thing, but alas. Okay, enjoy the episode.
Welcome back to OnScript, everyone. We've got a great episode lined up for you today. In the 2nd century, Justin Martyr had a discussion with a Jew named Trypho in Ephesus, and later Justin worked this discussion into a literary treatise. We call that today the Dialogue with Trypho. I'm going to read a passage from chapter 92 that pertains especially to the meaning of works of the law. Justin says this, speaking to Trypho: "For, as I have said earlier, you are distinguishable by no other means than by the circumcision of the flesh. Abraham indeed was considered just, not by reason of his circumcision, but because of his faith. For before his circumcision it was said of him, Abraham believed God, and it was reputed to him unto justice. We also, therefore, because of our belief in God through Christ, even though we are uncircumcised in the flesh, have the salutary circumcision, namely that of the heart, and we thereby hope to be just and pleasing to God, since we have already obtained this testimony from him through the words of the prophets. But you Jews were ordered to observe the Sabbaths and make offerings, and you were allowed by God to erect a place in which he could be invoked, so that you might not worship idols and forget God, and thus become impious and godless, as indeed you always seem to have been." This is Matthew Bates hosting today, coming to you from Quincy, Illinois. I'm speaking with Matthew J. Thomas about that vexed category in Paul's theology, works of the law. Welcome to OnScript, Matthew.
Thank you very much.
Well, Matthew Thomas has just released a stunningly important book, Paul's Works of the Law, in the perspective of 2nd century reception, published by Mohr Siebeck in their Wundt series in 2018. It's not just I who think it's a stunningly important book. Scott McKnight has just named it one of his award-winning books for Jesus Creed for the year. So it's a book that's already getting some good buzz. Folks aligned with the so-called new perspective on Paul and the old perspective are at loggerheads. There's good hope that Matthew Thomas's new book can help break the impasse. Now, Matthew, I happened to catch you at SBL, and you were on a panel for a session, and I was in the audience, and I went up afterwards to thank you for your presentation, and we struck up a conversation. So I was trying to remember if you were holding your book, since it pertained to your presentation, or what. But as soon as I discovered your book's topic, I knew immediately that I wanted to read it. I don't know if you remember the setting at all, but
I think
what were your
I think what had happened is I think that I think I saw your name tag, and I remembered that my friend Bill Reimer at the Regent College bookstore had recommended your book to me and said, "Hey, this book looks really great. You got to go and pick it up." So I actually hadn't picked it up yet, but I remembered your name, and so I think I said to you, "Hey, you're the Salvation by Allegiance Alone guy," or something to that effect. And I think that I can't remember where it went from there, but I think that there was some recognition on your end, either of what I had written or. I filled you, and I can't recall exactly, but I think it was actually, if I remember correctly, I think I recognize by the name tag. Yeah,
got it. So you anyway, so you obviously have been doing more work on second century Christianity, on works of law, and getting your message out in support of your book. So that's great. And certainly, as soon as one way or another, as soon as I found out that your topic was works of the law in the second century, that sort of marries two of my personal interests, as I'm very interested in second century Christianity and also debates about salvation theory. So anyway, this book's your revised dissertation, and it's really an ideal revised dissertation, right? Because as a dissertation topic, you broke a lot of new ground, but on a very theologically significant and timely topic. So I know some of our listeners, at least, are budding academics who are looking for good dissertation topics. How did you first conceive of this project then?
That's a great question. So I think probably as most good dissertation topics are, I conceived of it by accident. I was actually at Regent College in my first semester there. No, this is my second semester, my first year, and I came across this topic because I had written before I came to Regent. I was interested in the New Perspective on Paul stuff. I had gotten interested in the work of N.T. Wright, and had found a lot of that to be valuable and helped me to make sense of Paul in some ways that I hadn't been able to previously. And so this is, kind of new old perspective stuff was already an interest for me. And then my first semester, I wrote a paper on justification for J.I. Packer that looked at N.T. Wright's work on justification and John Piper's, and sort of did an assessment of those back and forth, since that was still. This would have been 2010, so it's still fairly recent debates that were going on at that point. And so then for the next semester, I was writing a paper that was going to be looking at the question of works of the law, because for the original thing that actually got me into this whole topic was just listening to a lecture, I think just in my car when I was driving around from Tom Wright, where he was talking about, in a certain instance, we didn't know how to, I think it was about faith of Christ, where he didn't know how to translate it as faith or faithfulness, because it's the same word. And for me, that was the starting point of everything, because growing up, I'd always been taught that, you kind of have, faith on one side and, works as, whether it's obedience or fidelity or whatever it happens to be, that's sort of the that's an antonym. Those are the opposite sides. So hearing that faith and faithfulness were actually the same word in Greek, I just blew my mind. I didn't have any idea what to do with it, which I think probably has some parallels with your own experiences. So I immediately said, gosh, I got to learn Greek. And so I started trying to learn Greek, and then ended up at Regent. And so with that foundation of, okay, so if faith and faithfulness are the same word, then what Paul means by pistis must be more robust than just some sort of intellectual assent. There has to be, it's got to be something more robust than that if I'm going to make sense of this in its original context. And so then the question that follows is, well, what does he mean by works of the law then? What is he actually trying to set in antithesis, to pistis, to this faith or faithfulness, or if we follow your reading, which I think is a good one, allegiance. And so I was writing a paper on this, and it was going to be just an old and new perspective, assessment in relation to the biblical texts on the question of works of the law. And so as part of the research for this, I had opened up Calvin's commentary on Romans, and from taking Dr. Packer's class, I had a chance to read, a fair bit of Calvin, and so I'd gotten accustomed to just what he's like as a writer and the way that rhetorically he tends to operate, especially on important polemical questions. And so I opened, I was reading his Romans commentary, and I saw that on this question, he says, it's a matter of doubt even amongst the learned what the works of the law mean. And then he proceeds to cite some church fathers against his own position, and doesn't cite any church fathers in favor of his own position. And I stood there in the Regent Library thinking to myself, this is very strange, because I'd never come across any sort of important question where Calvin hadn't cited church fathers in his favor when they happened to be there. And even in issues I think where you could say it's disputed whether the given church father actually agrees fully with him, they're always there. He's always bringing them as allies. And so seeing that he doesn't bring any of them, when he's presenting his own position, and even Augustine he goes and contrasts his position from, I just sat there thinking, gosh, this is really, really interesting. I wonder if you looked, in the earliest church fathers, the sources that are closest to Paul, I wonder what they would say in works of the law, and I wonder how that would match up with what you're finding in these old and new perspectives. And so I immediately just jumped back on my computer and started doing some searching. I think that the first sources that I looked in were Diognetus, the dialogue with Trypho, Irenaeus' Against Heresies, and then Origen's commentary on Romans. And in finding all this stuff, it sounds exactly like what Tom Wright's doing. And I was just astonished. And so I sent my professor an email real quick and said, hey, is it okay if I change my paper topic? And spent a couple days going revising it and writing this new paper, which then became an article and then was the seed for the dissertation. And the dissertation itself is just a larger version of it. So I guess to return to the original question, hey, how did you come across this? It was by accident, but I guess it was hopefully was a diligent sort of accident where, from my standpoint, I was really trying to get inside Calvin's reasoning and to understand how works of the law function from his standpoint, and then just in doing so, I just thought, boy, this bit doesn't match up with what I've read from Calvin elsewhere. There's something that really stands out here. And so that was the clue that there could be something to work on.
Yeah, that's great. What a fortuitous accident. But I think that's sort of a model for how it should be, right? That we should be doing diligent research, and then we have a moment of insight, and then we pursue it and find there's actually something there. The reality is the vast majority of dissertation topics are usually suggested by the dissertation supervisor, and I think that's oftentimes why they're difficult sometimes, as the graduate student has trouble, getting into it, and they don't have the same passion for it that their dissertation supervisor has, and so they languish. They have trouble writing. They have the difficult time finishing. So it is much better if you can have your own topic like that, and I think that's sort of you're a role model to us all in terms of how it should be done then.
Well, absolutely. I think that one, I'm really thankful to have come across a topic that for me was really important, where I just genuinely really wanted to know the answer. And so the dissertation, if it has value, it's in part just because I want to know this for myself, and then having learned from the early sources, just want to be able to share it with others, because I found the material to be tremendously helpful. So and I guess the other thing is credit to Jim Packer for having us read primary sources. If I hadn't spent a whole lot of time in Calvin, I wouldn't have had the eyes to see to see what was distinctive about what he says and doesn't say in that Romans commentary. And so yeah, credit to Jim for having us do original sources.
Well, let me introduce you a little more fully. Matthew J. Thomas is the author of Paul's Works of the Law in the Perspective of Second Century Reception with Mohr Siebeck that we're discussing today. He holds D.Phil in Theology, New Testament and Patristics from the University of Oxford. He has served as a visiting assistant professor of sacred scripture at St. Patrick's Seminary and is currently a visiting scholar at Franciscan University and a distant instructor in theology with Regent College. Matthew and his wife, Leeanne, met as MCS students at Regent, and I've got to say hooray for Regent. I also have an MCS from Regent in Biblical Studies, so we have a kind of a common heritage in that way. And Matthew has 2 children. Prior to coming to Regent, Matthew studied at Pepperdine and worked at Harbor House Ministries, an after-school program for youth in Oakland. Well, let's get into your book a little bit more. And as a way of framing, you've already kind of alluded to some of the basic dynamics of kind of the old perspective and the new, but maybe we could flesh that out a little bit further, and especially think in terms of if you were to sort of take this largely academic debate to the streets in terms of why would this be of interest to pastors and church leaders everywhere. What's at stake in this debate as it pertains to old and new perspectives and the role of the works of the law in it?
Great question. So, if you look, I think for a lot of Christianity, I would say Scripture as a whole often ends up being read through the lens of the Pauline antithesis of justification by faith apart from works of the law. That's certainly not the case everywhere, but definitely in a lot of contexts, you're sort of reading all of Scripture through that lens, and it kind of sets your interpretive framework. So it's important to get that right. And if you're looking at the 3 terms there, so justification, faith, works of the law, they're all 3 of them are actually disputed in some ways. And so I know your work has looked at faith, which I just alluded to as well, and how seeing that. The Greek term that's there has a more robust quality to it that the word belief often just doesn't do a great job of expressing or capturing. So all 3 of those terms are disputed in some way. The way you understand works of the law is going to, I think, necessarily influence what you understand both by faith and by justification. And so setting the antithesis, I would say, as precisely as you can is important. If you to summarize, briefly, what's the old perspective and what's the new perspective on works of the law?
Great. That was my next question anyway. So, so there you go.
Yeah.
And so my next question was, in defining the old perspective, you examined the works of law in Luther, Calvin, Bultmann, and Mohr. What unites those 4? So maybe you can sort of just segue right into that then.
Yeah, that's great. So if you're looking at the old perspective, so again, my in the book I do Luther, Calvin, and then 2 modern representatives of the Lutheran Reformed traditions, and so I picked Bultmann and Doug Mohr for this. Works of the law are understood. You can say the emphasis is on works when it comes to works of the law. So works of the law are understood as good works in general. They're understood as, you could say, there's all kinds of phrases that get used for it. So, any works at all, but often kind of, moral effort, self-powered striving is a phrase that, that Bultmann uses. Working or doing in general is one of the ways that that Mohr goes and describes it. But basically, anything that you do, any kind of action at all, can be a work of the law, and so that's really what Paul is trying to target is human actions or doing in general, and setting that antithesis to faith. And so the content of it, so actual meaning, it can really be any works at all. The different Old Perspective representatives, they sometimes will root these debates more in the context of the Jew-Gentile and discussions that Paul is in, and have, at least the immediate reference being the Torah. But the tendency is to want to abstract from that and just say, no, this is really anything at all. And so Luther will say, you can go and, expand the works of the law as much as possible. So, a monk is not justified by his vows and so on. And then the significance of it, what does it mean to go and do this? Well, you're trying to earn salvation. And so it's understood on an individualistic basis. So you as an individual are trying to do sufficient works to be accepted by God, to be justified by God. And so that's the way that it works. You're trying to earn as many points as possible, and then that goes. And I think the sense of faith then that you have from that is, I would say, it's a passive element. If works is active, if it's doing, then believing then is going to be something that is passive. I think just by necessity, it has to be something like that. These two terms are often not precisely defined. I remember, in John Piper's book on justification, where he's critiquing Tom Wright's work. I remember when I was writing a paper on it, one of the things I found challenging is that the word faith actually isn't defined there at all. It's described in a couple of instances, and so he says, it's entirely passive. It looks away from itself.
I remember that phrase. Yes.
But it doesn't actually define
entirely
it.
Receptive, I think, is actually maybe the language he uses.
Yeah.
It's purely received, or that'll be the language used. Yeah.
Exactly. So anyway, so it's it's a good example of the way that it functions. From the New Perspective standpoint, works of the law are understood as specifically the works of the Torah, so pertaining to a particular law. And within these, there are certain works that they identify as recurring, so circumcision, Sabbath, food laws. Often the other parts of the law, I would say that there can be some gray area as to, amongst the different New Perspective proponents, as to the degree to which or how these can function as works of the law. But the main difference, so you have, it's not good works in general, and they distinguish the category of good or moral works from the category of works of the law. And then the significance of practicing them isn't to go into, to earn sufficient merit or sufficient points to be justified by God. What one does by practicing the Torah, by being circumcised, observing the food laws, observing the Sabbath, what you do in this, it's not individualistic, it's corporate. You're doing this to be part of the chosen nation, the Jews. If you become circumcised, you become a Jew. You don't earn, merit points on an individual basis for it. And so the way the argument runs is that there's no, from the standpoint of Paul's arguments, you do not need to become a Jew in order to be accepted by God, to be justified by God. It's not necessary. And the example that Paul then would go back to, if you're following the New Perspective reading, is Abraham, because of course he's justified by God before he receives circumcision, before Moses is around, before there's any of the Mosaic law. If you have that, then a more robust account of what faith is, again, which corresponds pretty directly with your work, I think makes sense, and you can have some sense of it. And so there's you can say what Abraham is doing, at least again according to the New Perspective reading, isn't simply a passive receptive thing. It's more than that. There is a fidelity that marks Abraham, which is then the model for both for subsequent Jews and Christians as well.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think you sort of you've chosen the leading usual suspects, and nothing wrong in doing that, in selecting Ed Sanders, Jimmy Dunn, and Tom Wright as your representatives of new perspective voices. And I think one of the you've done a masterful job, I think, in this interview and in the book, at telling us what kind of unites the three, and it's really an emphasis on works of law, with the emphasis being more on the law part. I thought you did something really helpful, though, and I don't know that I'd seen anyone else lay it out in quite this way. And in speaking about what is different about them, especially in terms of how they explain why Paul felt that works of the law were objectionable. Sanders, you sort of delineated him focusing on experience, Dunn on social exclusion, and Wright for covenantal reasons. Could you tease that out a little bit more for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So this actually carries for both the old and new perspective, because one of the things that was surprising to me in researching and writing this was how much variety there is in both the old and new perspective. I think I had some sense within the new perspective that there was diversity as far as the way that the reasoning and logic works with respect to works of the law. For myself, I was actually surprised when I read Luther and really got into his head and followed the logic and got into Calvin, just how different they are on the reason for why works of the law are problematic. So I can start there if you want, because I just find it fascinating. For Luther, you have the argument that no one can go and observe the works of the law sufficiently. It's human inability. There's an anthropological problem. You can't do enough works to be justified before God. But then he goes on and has a second category, which is, works wouldn't justify anyway, even if you did do them, because it's faith that justifies. But then he has a third argument, and it's the third one that really seems to be the key one for him, that to actually try to be justified by works of the law is itself the epitome of sin. It's actually the worst thing that you can do. Because only Christ saves. And so if only Christ saves, and you're trying to be saved by observing the works of the law, then what you're doing is you're practicing self-idolatry. You're putting yourself in Christ's place. And so there's a really interesting passage where he goes and he looks at Jesus' prophecies, and what is it? I believe it's Matthew 24, where he says, many will come in that day saying, I am he, and will be the imitators of the Messiah. From Luther's standpoint, this is actually fulfilled whenever anyone tries to be justified by doing good works. They themselves are becoming the false messiahs. And so he identifies this as the epitome of sin. I don't know if I can follow that exegetically, but gosh, it's fascinating. It's really, really interesting, and Calvin gets nowhere near that. And so when you're reading Calvin, you have the first category of human inability, but it really goes and stays there. He doesn't problematize the attempt to be justified by works. Nor does he problematize, the conceptually being justified by works. The problem is just, hey, nobody can do it, and so you need someone to do it in your stead. And that, I think, that's reflected both in Bultmann and in Mohr. And when you're reading both Bultmann and Mohr, you can see, gosh, there's the really substantial differences between Luther and Calvin on this question. And you can see them both reflected in each of those representatives, which I find fascinating. When it comes to the new perspective, you're right. There is even when they're saying, hey, these are the points in question. So it's about the Torah, it's about these particular works, it's about whether or not you have to be a Jew or not. In order to be, part of, God's people, the logic does work quite differently. And so Sanders' logic is basically experiential. And so he is saying that Paul's arguments are driven fundamentally by Paul's own experiences and the experiences of his congregation. And so the experience of the congregations in receiving the Spirit apart from having adopted the Torah, having become Jews, but then Paul's own experiences, and so his own self-understanding. And so, Paul is called as the apostle to the Gentiles. He has this experience. And so this means that he has to then go to the Gentiles. And so because of that, works of the law have to sort of be, they have to be cut out. They can't really be part of the picture because I've got to go to the Gentiles. I'm the apostle of the Gentiles. And so there is the reasoning, I think, it comes across when you're reading Sanders. Paul seems like he's making a lot of sort of, post facto ad hoc arguments. But that's just from Sanders' standpoint. That seems to be the way that it makes sense according to him.
That's the very famous solution to plight, sort of a move that he made, as it's usually described, right? Exactly.
So that's I think that experience is the key category according to Sanders. With Dunn, it seems to be exclusivity. It's this attitude of exclusivity or exclusivism. I confess, when I was reading Jimmy's works and going through all his stuff, I think that of all the sections, I think that the Dunn one was the most difficult to write, just because I think that, Jimmy has done so much work on this in the past, since 1982. He's written so much on this. And in some ways, I find he's maybe been a bit of a moving target, just as far as... he has the original 1982 lecture, and then there's critiques of that. Then he goes and responds to those critiques, and there's just kind of back and forth. And so I wasn't always certain as I was first getting into it, like that I was completely capturing it. But I've had a chance to get to know Jimmy some, actually, who I really appreciate. And as I was going through, it seemed as though the exclusivism, the social function of excluding, and Jimmy's happy to use the modern language of excluding the other. That's the heart of what Paul's getting at. That's the heart of what the problem is of works of the law. That these particular works are being used by Jews to go and to exclude Gentiles, and that's the thing that needs to be objected to and set in antithesis to faith. That's the thing that excluding someone else can never be the basis for your own justification. And so because of that, it's interesting. There's actually it actually makes it so that Jimmy can go and expand the category of works of the law in a way has analogy to what the old perspective does. It's just, instead of expanding it to any sort of good works that you use to justify yourself, he can go and say these actually works of the law can be expanded to any contemporary sort of issues that are used to go and exclude believers from one another. So whether it's he gives biblical inerrancy as one, or papal infallibility, or male headship, or views on abortion or things like that. He says these can actually be works of the law too if you go and say these are used to exclude others. So that's Dunn's reasoning, which again is, you can see that, boy, it's pretty distinct from what Sanders is doing. And then Wright's is covenantal, so it's rooted in the covenant. And so he basically takes the Old Testament and says this provides your answers for what it is that Paul is doing, and so which is I would say is in contrast to Sanders' reading. Sanders, again, he doesn't find Paul's Old Testament exegesis to be consistent, and Wright really objects to that and says, no, this is consistent. This does work. And so from Wright's standpoint, the way the reasoning works is that the promises to Abraham are, they're meant for all the families, all the tribes of the earth. So they have this universal scope, and so it's meant to be for all people. So the Jew-Gentile dividing line can't be a permanent thing. But then the law itself doesn't go and solve things. It doesn't actually go and the problem of Adam that Abraham is, and his seed are supposed to be the solution to, isn't actually solved by the Torah. And so you need something else. You need something more, deeper than that. Doesn't actually work. And he sees Christ as actually going and fulfilling those covenant promises, and inaugurating the new age in which promises to Abraham has been fulfilled. The Spirit's been poured out, and the dividing line between Jew and Gentile is no longer necessary. Anyway, I know the answers to these are supposed to be a little shorter than that.
No, that's okay. No, I think it's a really helpful portion of your book, and I'm glad you teased that out for us further. Yeah, I do think that it's a helpful heuristic to sort of divide in that way. Although I think also I think you would acknowledge too that you're talking about emphases, right? Dunn certainly has some covenantal emphasis in his material too, but maybe it's not where his weight of energy finally lands.
Exactly,
maybe it's more on social exclusion.
Exactly.
So it's not to say that Dunn doesn't have a covenantal interest or that Sanders totally neglects it, but that Wright seems to front that more. And then ultimately, you're going to find that that's what we find the second century fathers do as well.
Exactly.
Let's, as we've done some heavy hitting stuff, let's do a speed round and just lighten things up a little bit before we circle back into the book. So the idea with the speed round is you just give me short answers, like 15 seconds, and you don't get to defend your answer. you just tell me what you think. All right.
That's great.
All right. So do you believe in ghosts?
Do I believe in ghosts? Probably, in some form or fashion.
Is there intelligent alien life elsewhere in the universe?
Gosh, I would say no, except I read so much C.S. Lewis, and he seems consistently to be open to the idea. And so, because I tend to defer to Lewis in almost everything, I'm going to say perhaps, if not probably.
Okay, Lewis has single-handedly persuaded you. That's amazing. All right, you walk up to the bartender and order what?
Wow. I tend to have pretty cheap taste when it comes to alcohol. So if it was a bartender, it would probably be a White Russian. But more likely, I wouldn't actually be at a bar. I would be at home with friends, and we'd probably be drinking malt liquor.
Okay. Well, when you said cheap, I thought you were going to say PBR or something.
It's cheaper than PBR sometimes.
Okay. Wow, that's too expensive for your taste. Okay.
Yeah.
What's the most important theology or biblical studies book of the last 50 years?
It's a hard question to ask a guy who's 33. So I don't want to show my cards too much with this, but the one that's coming to mind because of accessibility is Wright's book on justification. I think it's simple and does a lot of good stuff. So nobody else is going to say that book is the most important one, but it's the one that people can understand. It gets a lot right. Sorry, I'm giving you justification. I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's okay. What's a trend in society that scares you?
I was at the zoo a couple of days ago, and they wouldn't give me a lid to put on my hot chocolate because it was going to be bad for the environment. And of course, I have. It was me and my wife and my folks, and then our two kids. One of whom was 4.5. The other one just turned a year. And the idea that we're going to be walking around with 4 hot chocolates, which are quite hot, and the safest thing to do, the best solution to the situation is to have no lids. Just seems like a recipe for disaster. You're just going to end up with a lot of hot chocolate burns. So we escaped unscathed, but only barely, and that frightens me.
What's something you find embarrassing?
Something I find embarrassing. That is, I'm pretty atrocious at bowling. I'm pretty bad at bowling. I'm not as bad as I used to be, but I'm pretty bad at it. I remember one time I was in middle school and my grandma came to visit me from Mississippi, and we went bowling, and she bowled, I think she had it was like a 61, and I bowled a 5. I'm really competitive, and so I wasn't trying to lose or anything like that. I was genuinely, I didn't want to lose my grandma.
Okay,
I bowled a 5.
You're legit bad. That's bad. That's true.
I think.
Okay, I see why you're embarrassed.
So I can often make it into the hundreds these days, if I go. But I mean, usually I'll just say, let's just go play mini golf instead.
That's true. I mean, if I was that, I mean, I might say nose hair or something. But if I was that bad at bowling, maybe I would go with bowling. I don't know. All right. Well, we'll maybe do another speed round later. We'll see what time allows. But let's keep going on. Let's keep going a little bit with your book here. Then, so your angle is obviously reception history of Paul, and you're looking at works of law. And you might find somebody who's going to object to this approach, right? And they might say, what are you doing, Matthew Thomas? So what are you thinking? Why would we look at early church history? The Bible alone is our authority, not early church tradition. So your study is completely worthless to me. How are you going to respond to this antagonist who does not like who doesn't think there's any value in what you're doing?
Yeah. That's a great question. I do run into stuff like that sometimes. I would say that the person who I would be talking to is usually not going to be consistent in that position. And so often what I do is I just, if I encounter something like that, I try to say, okay, well, what do you take to be authoritative and why? And so if the answer is, well, I take the Bible, well, then kind of the response to that is, well, the reason that we have these particular texts, both the texts themselves, as far as the words and letters that are on the page, and the and then also the tradition of reading this particular set of books and not others in this order, is because we're following tradition. We're following what these earliest Christians pass along to us, and we're taking them as authoritative. And so if we do take the Bible itself, that's something that we receive from God through the hands of the early church. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that in some sort of kind of blind and unquestioning way that you necessarily have to just follow everything that the early church says and does. But it is to acknowledge that you're already taking the early church as an authority in receiving these particular texts. And then in following the reading tradition of following, these particular ones, not others, and reading them in this way. Other folks, I find that there is, if I'm talking to somebody from the Reformed tradition, for example, you can do this somewhat with people from Lutheran traditions too, but Luther tends. He often he seems almost happy to sort of dispense with, the broad swaths of Christian history. And then he will then go and frustrate his opponents when he goes and then appeals to that history and says, no, this is, the obvious example is, on the Eucharist. He goes and says, hey, for 15 centuries, everybody's said this is my body and understood this to be his body. How could you, Zwingli, go and say that, the whole church forever has been wrong, to which, I guess Zwingli's, rejoinder is probably, well, you're sort of doing something like that with justification. I thought that's sort of the, the modus operandi here. So Luther, you can do this one, but I think with Calvin, because he has a higher view of the early tradition. It's not uniform if you're following his writings, but in general, he tends to see his project as one that is restoring the church to the pure vision that it had in the early centuries. And so you can find some comments that from him that go and say, hey, the first 500 years is this kind of pure, unblemished period that he wants to go and use as a model for the church going forward, which is is quite expansive. I believe he goes all the way up to Gregory the Great, if I'm not mistaken. If you look in the controversy with Sadelet, it's clear that he's not saying, hey, everybody just go and follow me. My name is John Calvin, and I'm the greatest thing in the universe. Everybody just needs to do what I say, regardless of whether or not he thinks that, which I think is probably an unfair caricature. What what he goes and says, and I genuinely think he believes, he says that, all we have tried to do is restore the church to the ancient form that it held. And so when he's countering Satellite, he just basically says these are all innovations of later ages, and we want to get back to that ancient pure form. Well, that ancient pure form both includes the early church fathers, the early Christians, in the first couple centuries, and even if you don't want to include them and say no, it's that the pure ancient form is just the apostolic period, just the New Testament age. If nothing else, these are your closest witnesses that you would have to that. And if you, in general, Calvin's view of the tradition, particularly the early tradition, is quite high. He wants that to be not a primary authority, and sometimes not even a secondary authority. But I don't think secondary authority is an unfair or an inaccurate way to describe the way he understands early tradition. And so then you can go and say, hey, if you want to be a good student of John Calvin, this material is important, and it's significant. If you're looking at the sources that engage in this, I have a bit at the end where I just briefly dwell on how with the material that I'm engaging here, it doesn't appear to have been available to either Luther or Calvin.
Yeah, no, that's an important insight. I think that's oftentimes neglected by people who want to champion the Reformed period, without really being sufficiently critical, is that the apostolic fathers weren't published. They didn't have access to Barnabas. They didn't have access to Ignatius in terms of at least what we would understand to be the 7 letters that are received today in an unmodified way, right? As there was a complex interpolation tradition with the Ignatian letters, and nor do they have access to Justin Martyr. And so the lack of access to the earliest fathers, nor for Clement of Rome, all these were not available to the reformers, nor were they available to the Catholic Church at Trent. And so a lot of the sort of the bad blood between Catholics and Protestants that was spilled 500 years ago, right, was done without access to the documents that could best allow us to reconstruct the time period right after the New Testament and to weigh these matters. And that's why what you're doing is so important, right? Is that it's probably the most neglected piece of the puzzle. I think there have been a number of studies that have looked at justification in the 2nd century, that have looked at faith beyond the time period just of the New Testament, but not really much has been done to look at specifically works of law. There's been studies in Second Temple Judaism, studies in the New Testament itself, endlessly. Right, but to go beyond that and look at what the early fathers had to say about this gives us new data that was not available at that time period, and I think that's something that many people just don't understand about history. Yeah,
no, I think it's a really important point you make, and I think if I'm looking at specifically Luther and Calvin, I don't know how much my material would make a difference to Luther. It depends on sort of which parts of Luther you're reading, because Luther, of course, does have, he has a conservative bent in a lot of ways. But he's also happy to dispense with the tradition of interpretation in a number of areas as well, which is really striking when you're reading him. It's part of what makes him such a lively read. And so I'll go back and forth on which part of Luther I'm reading as far as the way that this early historical material would make a difference for him, because I think that the way that his reasoning works, I'm not certain
it's hard to say. I mean, because his fundamental insight, of justification by faith and the absolute contrast with any kind of doing that sort of flows from that, right? I mean, would he have ever come to that antithesis if he would have recognized that he couldn't extrapolate from works of the law to any kind of work in general?
Yeah. So a really fundamental one for this is one of the things that this study finds is the idea of Christ as, if Christ is the prophet like Moses, well, Moses is the lawgiver, and so the prophet like Moses is going to be, in giving the covenant, he's going to give the new law as well. And so Christ as the new lawgiver is just one of these things that's ubiquitous if you're looking in the first couple centuries of Christianity. And that idea itself is so it's so anathema to Luther. Luther, in so many places, in such strong language, rules out the idea of Christ as a lawgiver and says, I mean, basically, you need to separate Christ from Moses as far as possible and separate and completely rule out the idea of Christ as a lawgiver. He's the Savior. He's not the lawgiver. And he's so explicit in doing that you just think, gosh, I don't really know. It's hard to see how you could take that paradigm and integrate this material in there, because it's so insistent. No, Christ, he is the new lawgiver. If he institutes the new covenant, he gives the new law. Law and covenant go together. So with Luther, I just go back and forth on how this material would influence his thought. With Calvin, I would say it's a somewhat different picture, because he does take the early tradition so seriously. He's not somebody who wants to dispense with it. If you read in the commentary on Romans, you could tell he's put in an uncomfortable position in not being able to call any witnesses to his side from the patristic era when it comes to works of the law. And he still goes and does it, but it's not something that he does with great enthusiasm. And the other areas where he goes and has to do this, the example that comes to me is when he's looking. So Book 2 of the Institutes 1 through 5. He's looking at free will, the idea of free will, and just basically says, look, most of the church has just been really confused on this from the beginning. And then also goes to Augustine and says, actually, Augustine's probably the closest right on this, but even he doesn't completely get this right. And so he will go and distinguish himself from the preceding tradition when he has to, but he doesn't do it with any great enthusiasm. And I think because these sources, Tony Lane has done some good work on this and showing the patristic sources that were available to Calvin. It appears that Irenaeus, that he, I want to say it was around the third revision of the Institutes, that he got access to the works of Irenaeus, and he incorporates some of Against Heresies, here and there. But basically, everything prior to Irenaeus, it seems as though he doesn't have access to, which is what this whole book is. And even Irenaeus seems to have come in at a later stage in his own theological development. And so, because his view of tradition, I think, is consistently higher and of the early church as a model, it's, at least for me, is worth asking the question, how would this have influenced his thinking if he had access to these sources?
Yeah, I really like that. And I really liked your insight into the law of Christ as being a really important motif that we see in the patristic period, early patristic period, talking about the reason and why the Mosaic law is no longer binding, and that you note that it's interesting that this doesn't seem to have been a major motif in either old or new perspective discussions. And I think you're right. I mean, we're starting to see some of that get picked up. I wonder, for instance, what Josh Jipp would make of this. I don't know if you've had a chance to read his Christ is King book, but he speaks a lot about this, about Christ as the lawgiver, and looks at ancient patterns of kingship, and that a good king embodied his own law. And there's some interesting things to think about Christ as the lawgiver, as the one who lives out the allegiant pattern of life for us, as sort of the one who blazes the trail, who exercises pistis, right, and then enacts his new covenant principles. And that the good king is the one who embodies his own law. It's a powerful motif, I think, and Josh has done some good work there. But yeah, I wonder if you're going to be, if you have some more angles you're hoping to to move forward from your work in. I mean, obviously, your major conclusions are that the early conception of the works of the law are primarily, this is the Mosaic law that we're talking about. It's not that every part of the Mosaic law is equally foregrounded, but clearly those who received Paul in the second century understood circumcision, fasting, kosher laws to be what were paramount in the law in terms of works of the law, and that this cannot be equated with moral effort or moral striving or good deeds in general. It's the move that is made that says that when Paul talks about works or works of the law, that what he means is any kind of good deed, that those who received Paul in the second century do not agree with that. And so anyway, yeah, you've obviously you've done a very fine study here, and I think you've opened up probably some new avenues. Where do you see your work going from here? Do you have a trajectory that you want to move down next?
Oh boy, it's a great question. So I've a couple things working on. So actually one of the big influences for this project early on was Alister McGrath. I had a chance. He came to Regent in 2011, and our friend Don Lewis, one of the professors there, set up a meeting with him, and it was great. I was just walking around at Regent, and he says, he just finds me at the stairs and says, "Hey, you're meeting with Alister at 11:30." And I said, "I'm doing what?" Because I just finished my first year, at Regent. But I think Don's a great friend, and I think he saw the potential in this topic, and which I'd been talking about potentially writing a dissertation on. And so I had a chance to meet with Alister and talk to him about this idea, and he said, it's hard to find an original idea, but I would actually be really interested in seeing what you come up with. So by all means, go and do it, and let me know what happens. And so I mean, that was part of the encouragement to go forward with this. And then in the process of doing this, had a chance to work with him, and to work with him in revising the Justitia Dei book, because in talking with him, the early sections of his book are, he just basically said to me, look, I wrote these in 1982 when I first did this, and a lot of it was based on secondary scholarship, which was itself flawed in some ways, and so he's taking these his primary source stuff and incorporating it into his own work, and so so two of the areas that I've come across that he's currently working on revising for a fourth edition of his book are, so one works of the law, so the way that works of the law is understood in the early church, but the other one is on justification and the nature of justification. And so if the way his book works as it currently stands is the narrative runs that justification is understood as forensic prior to basically St. Augustine. And Augustine, of course, Latin, reading Greek, doesn't understand it correctly, so reads dikaiao as, justus facere, to make righteous, and that's where you get the understanding of justification as actually making you just or making you righteous, the factative understanding. And so that's that's appealed to by kind of biblical scholars all over the place, just because Alister is so good that one just naturally defaults to him. And so you'll see Tom Wright going and appealing to Alister and say, well, as Alister McGrath goes and shows here, and it is, I find Alister's analysis elsewhere to be really good. The thing for me is as I was writing this dissertation and putting it in book form and doing all this research, I kept coming across instances where justification seemed to be understood in the factative sense, and so the sense of being made righteous, and all of which, of course, were prior to Augustine. And so I come across examples of this in Barnabas and Justin and Irenaeus. If you're thinking of authors who originally were writing in Greek, and so they're not going to there's no issue of Latin mistranslation or anything like that. It just seems that this is the way they're understanding this, and then you can find later if you go into Chrysostom, anybody like that, and then of course the whole Greek Orthodox tradition following from Chrysostom understands justification in a factive sense, and being made righteous. But then also I stumbled across this in Tertullian as well, which is fascinating because having a Latin representative who against Marcion, book 5, where he's doing his he's basically doing his summary. It's basically an early commentary on all the Pauline epistles, and so he's looking at Galatians and writing against Marcion. It talks about becoming more justified, and you look at the Latin there, and it's really hard to make sense of it in a strictly forensic sense. It seems as though there's a factative conception that he's dealing with. And so I went and I basically brought all this to Alister and said, I have no idea what to make of all this, but because in my mind I had just followed what I had gotten from him and elsewhere, that this is a strictly a forensic category, and I'm running across all this material. It seems like it's a factative thing, and so he's currently using the primary source material to go and to revise the early chapters of Justitia Dei. But the next project that I've been hoping to work on would be to do a primary source work on justification that looks at the nature of justification specifically in the earliest patristic era. And so basically giving all of I've just often found when you're looking at the early church believed this, early church believed this, it's often very light on footnotes and primary sources. And so what I would hope to do would be to put out a resource that gives a lot of that primary source material, and the discussions of justification that you have in the later first, second, third centuries and going forward, and to show how you seem to have both the forensic sense, so being vindicated, acquitted, forgiven, declared righteous, but then also the forensic sense as well. As far as actually being made righteous, and to show how it is that these seem to go together. And then the third one, which is for me is a tentative category, but which I keep running into, and I think that there's something here, although don't quote me on it quite yet, is the incorporative element to justification. So justification as placing you inside of the body and placing you. And, Tom Wright talks about some of this. So there's a covenantal sense. It goes in justification makes you part of the covenant people. And in passages like 1 Clement 32, that one in particular, it just seems like that is an incorporative sense to justification as far as yes, being forgiven, yes, being made righteous, but fundamentally being placed within the covenant, being placed within the body, being made part of God's people. That's the most fundamental sense that you have in that text, and that of course ties in with baptism and the link between justification and baptism and being becoming part of God's family. So that's the next work that I'm in the research phase right now and trying to figure out.
It sounds like it'll be a very helpful book in terms of problematizing some of these categories that are a little too tidy, in Pauline theology, right?
Yeah, I hope so, because what I want to do more than anything else, it can problematize things, but what I really want to do is I want to create a resource that'll help people, because I haven't come across a resource that looks comprehensively at this early data and just lays the sources out to say, here's your passages and context for how it is that justification is understood in the earliest patristic sources that we have. I think I think a resource like that, no matter what kind of standpoint you're coming from, I think that has potential to be useful. So that, whether you agree with it, whether you disagree, whether you think that the early sources understood Paul and justification rightly or incorrectly, that you at least have a clear sense of, hey, this is what the earliest witness,
absolutely.
What they meant by it.
Yeah, the fact is just doing good history requires that we look at reception history, right? And that it has to be put into the calculus of probability, right? If you're trying to figure out what Paul meant, right? Looking at what came after and how people understood what Paul meant in the immediate time period, it must be given weight. How much weight is up to dispute, right? But it must be given weight, and that will be a very valuable project for us. Well, we're running a little bit shy on time, so how about we do a couple more speed round questions, and then I'll give you a final question, and then we'll have to sign out.
Yeah,
so you ready for a couple more speed rounds?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Do you like to go camping?
I theoretically like to go camping. Could I tell you the last time I went camping? Not off the top of my head, but I have had it occur to me that camping is fun. My friend Ryan Suzuki took his family camping I want to say, was it last year? Just got a tent, went to the local park, and they slept in it, and he said it was really fun. So we've been hoping to do it with them at some point, just haven't gotten around to it.
All right, are you going to sing me a song right now on the spot? Can you do it?
If I was to sing a song, it would probably be the My Little Pony theme song.
Sing it for us, My Little Pony. Let's hear it.
It goes, My Little Pony, My Little Pony, and then something about friendship and magic. Do you happen to know the rest?
I should, because I also I believe on your bio you said you had a 4-year-old girl. I have one also. But, somehow we've avoided My Little Pony, but
if you can continue that going,
I could probably sing you the theme song of Daniel Tiger. It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day. It's sort of like themed off the Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, right? I remember that.
Yeah,
I remember. So the other
Daniel Tiger's in at our house.
Yeah. The other big one is the Ninja Turtle theme song has been going around our house a whole lot because while our son's name is Raphael, he's not actually named after the Ninja Turtle. But of course, Raphael was also my favorite Ninja Turtle, and our daughter just thinks that Ninja Turtles is the greatest thing in the universe. So she's constantly singing the Ninja Turtle theme song in our house, which I think is glorious.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, if you're going to complete a PhD outside of theology, history, or religion, what would the field be?
Outside of theology, history, or religion. So completely out of religious studies in general. So as an undergraduate, I did political science and international studies. And when I moved more towards ministry work, my heart was really moved towards kind of more active ministry stuff. And so I don't have the same passion for that I used to, but I still find it really interesting and really important. So it'd probably be something in international relations, international politics, something like that.
That's great. All right. So your final question, then you get a last parting shot at your audience here. If your book is mentioned in a sermon, what do you hope is being taught?
Wow. I hope that what it's being taught, the sermon is actually a sermon on your book on how
I don't think that's allowed. I don't think you can say that.
I hope it's a sermon on your book and talking about how what faith is biblically is more than just intellectual assent. It's more than I came across Tom Schreiner's review of your book, and where he goes and talks about how the the gift of righteousness is something that we receive with an open hand, and that we're not bringing anything. And I think that's actually correct. I just think that faith biblically is also hanging on to the thing that we receive with an open hand. I think that pistis has both sides to it. So we receive faith, but then we hold on to it. We hang on to it, and that the fidelity part. Or allegiance, if we want to go that route, that is that's just fundamental to what it means to actually really believe. And so if you're thinking of, if I try to think of, how do you make sense of the word, believe biblically? Because believe is often relegated to, like Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy in English. Well, believe you can also use that well if you're thinking of, say you're on a basketball team and the coach goes and leaves you in the fourth quarter and says, hey, I want you to take the shot. You would say, man, the coach really believed in me. There's a sense if you take that, then you're getting that robust sense of what it is to actually believe. And so I think that what you do with seeing that, how biblically what faith means is more than just an intellectual assent. It's more than just sort of a one-time commitment kind of thing, or to say that to give it's more than a simple profession. It's the receiving with an empty hand, but also hanging on to what God gives us. I think that if what I'm doing on Works of the Law, if it helps as a footnote in that sermon to say that what Paul is going and trying to set an antithesis to this isn't saying, hey, works are bad, or working is bad, or moral effort is bad. That's not fundamentally what he's trying to problematize. It's the issue of the Torah and whether we need to continue to obey the Torah. And Paul's answer is, no, we don't, because Christ actually is the Messiah. He's brought the new covenant, the new law with him. And if you look back before that, Abraham, he was righteous, he was made just, he was justified by something more fundamental than that. Then before there was any law, before there was even the sign of circumcision, it was because he trusted in God. And if you look at his example in his life, that's the model for us. That's what we're meant to be. We're meant to be the people who we place our hope, we place our trust in God, and He holds our allegiance. And so, if my book is a helpful footnote to the sermon, which is based actually on your book, then I will be very, very, very glad, and I hope that it has use for folks in that way.
Well, you're too kind. You're too kind. Thanks so much, Matthew.
No, absolutely. Just thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is Matthew Bates for OnScript, and I've been talking with Matthew J. Thomas about his new book, Paul's Works of the Law in the Perspective of Second Century Reception. It's in the Vunt series, published by Mohr Siebeck, 2018. There's a link on our website to the book for purchases, www.onscript.study. Until next time.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.